There's a narrow strip of land in southern Thailand, no wider than 50 kilometers at its thinnest point, that has quietly sat at the center of one of the most consequential geopolitical debates of the last century. It is called the Kra Isthmus. It is not famous. Most people could not point to it on a map. But for the past several decades, it has been the subject of secret meetings, diplomatic negotiations, billion-dollar feasibility studies, and the long, patient, strategic calculations of the most powerful nation in Asia. And now, after years of rumors, delays, and political obstacles, China has committed $11 billion to do what no one before has managed: cut a canal straight through it. What happens next will reshape global trade, redraw the map of maritime power, and force every nation on Earth to reckon with a world in which China no longer depends on anyone else's waterways to move its goods. To understand why this project matters so deeply, you have to understand how the modern world actually moves. Every year, roughly 90% of everything traded between nations travels by sea. Not by air, not by road, not by rail, by sea. The clothes you wear, the food you eat, the fuel that powers your city, the components inside the device you are watching this on right now, almost all of it spent time on a cargo ship, crossing an ocean. And those ships, despite the vastness of the seas they sail, are funneled through a surprisingly small number of narrow passages. These passages are called choke points, and they are, in every meaningful sense of the word, the pressure points of civilization. Control them, and you control the flow of the modern world. Threaten them, and you can bring entire economies to their knees without firing a single shot. The most critical of these choke points, by almost any measure, is the Strait of Malacca. It is a narrow body of water, roughly 800 kilometers long, and at points less than 3 kilometers wide, that sits between the Malay Peninsula on one side and the Indonesian island of Sumatra on the other. Every single day, somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 ships pass through it. It carries more than a quarter of the world's traded goods. It handles around a third of global shipping traffic. And it is the primary route through which oil flows from the Middle East to the economies of East Asia: Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and above all, China. Nearly 80% of China's oil imports pass through this single stretch of water. That number alone should make clear how significant this strait is to Beijing. It is not just a trade route. It is a lifeline. And it is a lifeline that China does not control. Chinese strategists have a name for this vulnerability. They call it the Malacca Dilemma. The phrase was first used publicly in 2003 by Chinese President Hu Jintao, who stated openly that China was too dependent on a shipping route that could, under the right circumstances, be closed off. The Strait of Malacca is flanked by Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia, nations that have historically maintained close security relationships with the United States. The U.S. Navy operates the most powerful fleet in the world, with a significant presence across the Indo-Pacific. In any serious military confrontation between Washington and Beijing, over Taiwan, over the South China Sea, over any number of flashpoints that geopolitical analysts routinely flag as potential triggers, the United States would have the ability to significantly disrupt or threaten Chinese shipping through Malacca. It would not even need to physically block the strait. The mere threat, the positioning of naval assets, the declaration of a blockade would be enough to send insurance premiums soaring, reroute shipping traffic, and create supply chain chaos inside China within weeks. This is the nightmare scenario that Beijing has been quietly engineering its way out of for 2 decades. The Belt and Road Initiative, China's trillion-dollar global infrastructure program, is in large part a response to this dilemma. An attempt to build overland trade corridors through Central Asia, pipelines through Myanmar, ports across the Indian Ocean that would reduce dependence on Malacca. But overland routes are slow. They are expensive to operate. They cannot handle the volume of cargo that maritime shipping can, and they pass through countries with their own political instabilities and security vulnerabilities. They are supplementary solutions, not replacements. What China has always wanted, what its strategists have always known would be the most elegant and permanent solution to the Malacca Dilemma, is a second sea route, a canal that would allow ships traveling between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea to bypass the Strait of Malacca entirely. And the only place on Earth where such a canal could be built is across the Kra Isthmus in southern Thailand. The idea of cutting a canal through this isthmus is not new. It is, in fact, one of the oldest infrastructure proposals in Southeast Asian history. The French first seriously studied the possibility in the 17th century. The British considered it during the height of their colonial power in the region. Various Thai governments have floated proposals, commissioned studies, and debated the idea at the highest levels of government for more than 100 years. The economic logic has always been compelling. A canal through the Kra Isthmus would connect the Gulf of Thailand on the eastern side to the Andaman Sea on the western side, allowing ships to bypass not just the Strait of Malacca, but the entire southern tip of the Malay Peninsula. Depending on the specific route chosen, the canal would save ships somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 kilometers of sailing distance. It would cut transit time by 2 to 4 days, and at the scale at which global shipping operates, with tens of thousands of vessels moving millions of tons of cargo every week, those 2 to 4 days translate into savings of billions of dollars per year in fuel, crew costs, port fees, and time-sensitive cargo penalties. But every time the proposal reached the point of serious momentum, it stalled. The obstacles were enormous. The engineering challenges were significant. The terrain is not flat. The construction would require massive displacement of earth and water, and the canal would need to be deep enough and wide enough to accommodate the largest vessels in the modern shipping fleet. The financial requirements were staggering. Estimates for the project have ranged from $25 billion to over $100 billion, depending on the scale and the route. The political complications were even more daunting. Malaysia has always opposed the canal because its construction would devastate the port of Singapore and the port economies along the Malay Peninsula that depend on Malacca traffic. Singapore, which handles one of the busiest ports in the world, processing hundreds of millions of containers every year, would face an existential threat to its economic model if a significant portion of regional shipping traffic were rerouted through Accra Canal. These nations lobbied against the project at every opportunity, and their concerns carried weight with potential investors and with Thailand's own political establishment. Thailand itself was divided. The southern provinces through which the canal would run are predominantly Muslim and have long been the site of a low-grade separatist insurgency, bringing tens of thousands of foreign construction workers into that region, displacing communities, transforming the landscape. These were not abstract policy concerns. They were live political liabilities. And successive Thai governments, wary of the regional implications and the diplomatic fallout with Malaysia and Singapore, repeatedly declined to move forward. What changed everything was China's willingness to commit, not just to study the project, not just to express interest, but to actually put money on the table. Over the past several years, as part of a broader recalibration of its Belt and Road investment strategy, China shifted its focus toward high-impact infrastructure projects that delivered direct strategic value: ports, rail corridors, energy pipelines, and maritime routes. The Accra Canal fits this framework perfectly. It is expensive, yes, but from Beijing's perspective, the return on investment is not measured purely in shipping fees and toll revenues. It is measured in strategic autonomy. Every dollar spent on the Accra Canal is a dollar spent buying China out of its dependence on the Strait of Malacca. That is a price Beijing is willing to pay. The current $11 billion commitment represents the first serious tranche of what will ultimately be a much larger investment. The figure covers initial engineering work, environmental assessments, land acquisition in the relevant provinces, preliminary construction on the eastern terminus near the Gulf of Thailand, and the infrastructure needed to support a massive influx of construction personnel and equipment. It is the down payment on a project that, if completed, will be one of the largest and most consequential infrastructure achievements of the 21st century. The proposed canal route runs approximately 100 kilometers across the narrowest viable section of the isthmus. It would be dug to a depth of around 25 meters, deep enough to accommodate fully loaded supertankers and the largest container vessels currently in operation. The width would allow 2 lanes of traffic moving in opposite directions simultaneously, which is essential for the kind of throughput that would make the canal economically viable. Along the route, deepwater ports would be constructed on both the eastern and western ends, along with refineries, logistics hubs, industrial zones, and the supporting road and rail infrastructure that a project of this scale requires. The economic projections, even the conservative ones, are remarkable. Independent analysts estimate that the Accra Canal, once operational, could divert somewhere between 20 and 30% of current Malacca traffic to the new route. That would make it, almost immediately upon opening, one of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth. The toll revenues alone, based on current shipping volumes and prevailing canal fee structures, could generate billions of dollars annually. Thailand, which has struggled for decades to develop its southern provinces into economically productive regions, would receive a massive injection of investment, employment, and infrastructure. For Bangkok, the political calculus has shifted. The development potential is simply too large to ignore. But the true significance of this canal is not economic. It is strategic, and it is military, and it runs far deeper than shipping fees and transit times. The completion of the Accra Canal would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific in ways that Washington, Tokyo, Japan, and South Korea are watching from a different angle. Both nations depend heavily on seaborne energy imports, and both route the bulk of those imports through the Strait of Malacca. In theory, Accra Canal offers them an alternative route that could improve supply chain resilience. But both nations are also close security allies of the United States, and both have significant concerns about a broader shift in Indo-Pacific maritime power toward China. The Kra Canal is not neutral infrastructure. It was designed by Chinese strategic planners to solve a Chinese strategic problem. The fact that it might also benefit Japanese and Korean shippers does not change the fundamental geopolitical dynamic it creates. There's another dimension to this project that rarely gets discussed in mainstream coverage, but that any serious analysis cannot ignore: the question of what happens to the canal's operation and governance. When the Panama Canal was finally handed over to Panama in 1999, the United States had spent decades ensuring that the legal and political framework for the canal's operation was structured in a way that protected American interests even after formal U.S. control ended. The agreements governing neutrality, transit rights, and military access were painstakingly negotiated. China, which has considerable experience in infrastructure financing arrangements that come with governance strings attached, port concessions in Sri Lanka, infrastructure agreements in Pakistan, investment frameworks across Africa, will inevitably seek some form of operational influence over a canal that it has financed. What that influence looks like in practice, how it is structured in the agreements between Beijing and Bangkok, and what rights other nations will have to transit the canal under what conditions, these are questions that will define whether the Kra Canal is genuinely open global infrastructure or a Chinese strategic asset draped in the language of international commerce. Thailand, for its part, is attempting to navigate this with care. The current Thai government has been more openly receptive to Chinese investment than previous administrations, but it is also aware that accepting Chinese financing on terms that compromise Thai sovereignty would be politically toxic domestically and diplomatically damaging regionally. Nations depend heavily on seaborne energy imports, and both route the bulk of those imports through the Strait of Malacca. In theory, a Kra Canal offers them an alternative route that could improve supply chain resilience. But both nations are also close security allies of the United States, and both have significant concerns about a broader shift in Indo-Pacific maritime power toward China. The Kra Canal is not neutral infrastructure. It was designed by Chinese strategic planners to solve a Chinese strategic problem. The fact that it might also benefit Japanese and Korean shippers does not change the fundamental geopolitical dynamic it creates. There's another dimension to this project that rarely gets discussed in mainstream coverage, but that any serious analysis cannot ignore: the question of what happens to the canal's operation and governance. When the Panama Canal was finally handed over to Panama in 1999, the United States had spent decades ensuring that the legal and political framework for the canal's operation was structured in a way that protected American interests even after formal U.S. control ended. The agreements governing neutrality, transit rights, and military access were painstakingly negotiated. China, which has considerable experience in infrastructure financing arrangements that come with governance strings attached, port concessions in Sri Lanka, infrastructure agreements in Pakistan, investment frameworks across Africa, will inevitably seek some form of operational influence over a canal that it has financed. What that influence looks like in practice, how it is structured in the agreements between Beijing and Bangkok, and what rights other nations will have to transit the canal under what conditions, these are questions that will define whether the Kra Canal is genuinely open global infrastructure or a Chinese strategic asset draped in the language of international commerce. Thailand, for its part, is attempting to navigate this with care. The current Thai government has been more openly receptive to Chinese investment than previous administrations, but it is also aware that accepting Chinese financing on terms that compromise Thai sovereignty would be politically toxic domestically and diplomatically damaging regionally. Bangkok wants the canal. It wants the economic development, but it does not want to become a client state. The negotiations over the specific terms of Chinese involvement, the financing structure, the governance framework, the ownership of the port facilities, the operational control of the waterway, are ongoing, and they will be among the most consequential diplomatic negotiations in Southeast Asia in the coming decade. Construction on a project of this scale does not happen overnight. The most optimistic timelines suggest that the canal could be operational by the mid-2030s. More realistic assessments put the completion date closer to 2040 or beyond, accounting for the complexity of the engineering, the likelihood of political disruptions, the need for extensive environmental remediation, and the practical challenges of building major infrastructure through a region with active security concerns. But the $11 billion commitment signals something important regardless of the precise timeline. It signals that this project has passed the point of conceptual debate and entered the phase of material reality. The shovels are not all in the ground yet, but the money is moving. The plans are being drafted. The contractors are being assembled. The world's response to this development has been telling. Washington has been notably quiet in its public statements, which is itself a signal. American strategic culture tends toward vocal opposition when major Chinese projects are announced, but the Krai Canal sits in complicated territory because it involves a sovereign nation, Thailand, which is formally a U.S. treaty ally, making decisions about infrastructure on its own territory. Any American attempt to overtly pressure Bangkok to reject Chinese financing would be diplomatically awkward, potentially counterproductive, and would almost certainly push Thailand further into the Chinese orbit rather than pulling it back. So Washington watches. It builds relationships. It quietly offers alternative financing frameworks through the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, the G7's answer to Belt and Road, and it hopes that Thai sovereignty concerns and regional diplomatic pressure will complicate the project enough to slow it down. China, meanwhile, moves with the patient confidence of a nation that has spent 20 years building the financial and diplomatic infrastructure needed to make exactly this kind of project possible. The $11 billion is not a gamble. It is the calculated deployment of accumulated leverage, economic, diplomatic, and strategic, toward a goal that Beijing has been pursuing since at least 2003. The Malacca dilemma was always going to require a bold solution. The Krai Canal is that solution, and unless something dramatic and unexpected intervenes, it is going to be built. What the world looks like when it is built is a question worth sitting with. A world in which China has its own canal, its own route, its own maritime corridor between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. That is a world in which the strategic geography of Asia looks fundamentally different from the one we have known for the past 2 centuries. The British Empire was built in significant part on the control of maritime choke points. The American era of global influence rested on the same logic, applied through a network of alliances, bases, and naval presence that gave Washington effective oversight of the world's critical shipping lanes. A Krai Canal does not end American maritime dominance overnight, but it is one piece of a much larger puzzle that China is assembling, piece by piece, billion by dollar, port by pipeline, toward a future in which Beijing no longer needs to ask anyone's permission to move its ships. The Krai Isthmus is 50 kilometers wide. In the long sweep of history, that is not a very large obstacle. China has decided it is no longer willing to let that narrow strip of land define the limits of its power. And that decision, made in Beijing and funded with $11 billion of Chinese capital, will send ripples across the entire Indo-Pacific for the rest of this century. The story of the Krai Canal is also, in a deeper sense, the story of what infrastructure means in the 21st century. For most of human history, the nations that built the roads, the ports, the canals, the railways, those were the nations that accumulated power. Rome's roads held the empire together. Britain's ports made it the center of world commerce. America's interstate highway system was not just a transportation project. It was a statement about what kind of country the United States intended to be. Infrastructure is never purely practical. It is always also political. It is always also a declaration of intent. And when China commits $11 billion to carve a new waterway through the heart of Southeast Asia, it is making a declaration that goes far beyond shipping logistics. It is saying, plainly and without ambiguity, that it intends to shape the physical geography of the world to match its strategic needs, that it is no longer content to operate within the infrastructure architecture that previous powers built, and still, to varying degrees, control, that the age in which the world's most important trade routes were designed and managed by Western powers or their allies is drawing to a close. This shift does not happen dramatically. It does not happen with a single announcement or a single project. It happens incrementally, deal by deal, port concession by port concession, canal by canal. The Krai Canal is one node in a network that China has been constructing for 2 decades. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor links Xinjiang to Gwadar on the Arabian Sea. The pipelines through Myanmar bypass Malacca for oil imports from the Middle East. The ports in Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and across East Africa give Chinese shipping alternative stops along the Indian Ocean rim. Each of these projects, taken individually, can be dismissed as a bilateral infrastructure deal. Taken together, they form a coherent alternative architecture for global trade. One designed and financed by Beijing and structured to reduce Chinese dependence on the systems its rivals control. The $11 billion for the Krai Canal is therefore not just an investment in a waterway. It is an investment in the completion of a vision in which China sits at the center of a web of trade routes that it built, that it finances, that it influences, and that it can, if necessary, leverage. A vision in which the Malacca dilemma, the chokehold that kept Chinese strategists awake for 20 years, is finally, permanently resolved. A vision in which the geography of power in Asia has been quietly, patiently, expensively rewritten. The canal will take years to build. There will be setbacks, delays, political complications, and diplomatic friction at every stage. The engineering challenges alone are substantial enough to test even the most capable construction teams in the world. The governance negotiations between Bangkok and Beijing will be long and difficult. The regional opposition from Singapore, Malaysia, and their allies will be sustained and sophisticated. The United States will use every lever of diplomatic and financial influence it has to complicate the project without directly confronting it. But the money is there, the commitment is made, the plans are drawn. And China, as it has demonstrated repeatedly over the past 2 decades, is very good at building things that once seemed impossible. The Three Gorges Dam, the world's largest high-speed rail network, the Belt and Road ports strung across 3 continents, the bridges connecting Hong Kong to Macau across open ocean. China builds. And when China builds with strategic intent behind the construction, the results tend to be permanent. By the time the Kra Canal opens, whether in the mid-2030s or the early 2040s, the world will have changed enough that its arrival may feel almost inevitable. The new waterway will be celebrated in Beijing as the resolution of a vulnerability that constrained Chinese power for a generation. It will be mourned in Singapore as the end of an era. It will be studied in Washington and Tokyo as a case study in how infrastructure shapes strategic reality. And in the villages and provinces of southern Thailand, life will simply be different, noisier, more industrial, perhaps more prosperous, certainly more connected to the great currents of global trade and power that flow across the oceans. The Kra Isthmus waited a long time for this moment. 50 kilometers of land between 2 seas, holding the world's most consequential infrastructure question in suspension for 100 years. The answer has finally arrived, and it came in the form of an $11 billion Chinese investment, a Thai government willing to move forward, and a Beijing that has decided it is done waiting.